Summer of 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The German prisoner stared at the bottle in his hand as though it were a piece of forbidden magic. The brown liquid fizzed and bubbled in a way he had never seen before. After 2 years in the desert, living on hard biscuits, ersatz coffee, and whatever scraps the Afrika Korps could scrounge, this sweet, sparkling drink, called Coca-Cola, felt like a hallucination made real. It cost 5 cents at the camp canteen, the guards told him. The same nickel American children used from their weekly allowance. For a man who had marched across North Africa under Rommel's command, who had fought in burning sand on dwindling rations, the idea that this luxury was routine in America felt impossible. That summer, more than 370,000 German prisoners held across the United States would discover the same unsettling truth. Soft drinks, candy bars, ice cream, things that most German children had never even tasted, were everyday purchases for ordinary Americans, treats that had vanished from the Reich long before Stalingrad fell. And as these men tasted American abundance for the first time, something far deeper began to crumble inside them. Nazi propaganda had fed them images of a weak, decadent America whose society teetered on collapse. Yet here, even in the camps meant for enemy soldiers, abundance seemed effortless. Rations overflowed with sugar and chocolate. Prisoners were served foods that German civilians couldn't even dream of: fresh eggs, real coffee, milk, fruits, meats, desserts. The mathematics of plenty slowly rewrote their entire worldview. It began the moment the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers boarded American-controlled transports expecting cruelty, starvation, and brutality. Instead, within hours, they were handed American K-rations, field meals the U.S. Army often criticized as bland and insufficient. But to these desert veterans, the contents looked like the menu of a lost paradise. Crackers, processed cheese, chocolate, fruit bars, sugar tablets, instant coffee, cigarettes. Emergency rations in the U.S. Army felt like feasts to men who had been living on the edge of hunger. At the North African processing camps, American cooks served pancakes dripping with syrup, fresh eggs, and glasses of milk, foods the German military hadn't provided their troops in years. One captured officer would later tell the Red Cross, "We expected starvation as punishment. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army ever had." That was the first moment we began to question everything we believed. Then came the voyage across the Atlantic. For many prisoners, this was the moment the scale of American power began to settle in. They boarded Liberty ships, mass-produced steel transports built so quickly that one was finished every 42 hours at peak wartime production. The ships held thousands, and yet the food served to prisoners was the same as served to the crew. 3 full meals a day. Fresh bread, vegetables, meat, real coffee, sweetened with sugar and mixed with milk. Not powdered, not ersatz, real. Some ships even had ice cream machines. The logbooks confirm it. On July 4, 1943, the USS General M.B. Stewart served ice cream to German prisoners in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. 10 gallons a batch. Men who had not tasted ice cream since childhood sat on steel decks holding bowls of it, stunned into silence. It was more than a dessert. It was a revelation. A frozen message carried across the sea. The American war machine had such abundance that it could feed luxuries to its enemies while fighting a global conflict. When the ships reached Norfolk or Newport News, the education continued. German prisoners stared at dockside warehouses bursting with cargo. Norfolk's port, 4,300 acres of cranes, rail lines, warehouses, and piers, moved more goods in a week than major German ports moved in a month. And inside the workers' shops, shelves overflowed with dozens of candy bar varieties from companies the prisoners had never heard of: Mars, Hershey, Nestle, each sold for 5 cents. The same price everywhere, from Maine to California. Traveling inland by train shattered even more illusions. These were not cattle cars or freight wagons. Prisoners were transported in passenger coaches. Dining cars served them fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee. Not as a gesture of mercy, but because that was simply how American trains operated. When they finally reached the camps, Crossville in Tennessee, Aliceville in Alabama, Hearne in Texas, the shock deepened. Electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, heated barracks. PX stores filled with Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, and more candy than a German child saw in a year. Ice cream when weather and refrigeration allowed. Fresh fruit, cigarettes, beer. Prisoners earned 80 cents a day for labor, later raised to a full $1. In a country where a Coke cost 5 cents and a candy bar the same, a prisoner could buy 16 soft drinks a day. The concept defied everything they had been taught about American poverty and chaos, and perhaps nothing symbolized American power more than Coca-Cola itself. The Coca-Cola Company produced 5 billion bottles in 1943 alone. 5 billion. The U.S. military guaranteed every soldier worldwide access to a 5-cent Coke, no matter how far across the globe they were deployed. German prisoners discovered that this drink existed everywhere. Camps received deliveries. Factories had machines humming with chilled bottles. Schools stocked it. Kids drank it on their way home. Americans drank it casually, sometimes leaving bottles half-finished, tossing them aside without a second thought. The luxury that Germany could not produce in wartime America treated like tap water. Technically inclined German prisoners were astonished by how uniform the beverage tasted across the entire country. The idea that a product could be perfectly identical in Tennessee, Oregon, or New York exposed a level of industrial coordination Germany had never achieved. In some camps, particularly in the Deep South, ice cream became the symbol of American absurdity, a luxury that Germans associated with childhood holidays and pre-war prosperity appeared in prison cafeterias. American Army records confirm that at many camps ice cream was served during summer months as part of standard menus. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, hand-cranked freezers made gallons of ice cream for the prisoners on July 4th. At others, electric ice cream makers churned out chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, even butter pecan. Germans could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Ice in July. Cream used for entertainment food. Sugar used by the pound. Children in nearby towns buying ice cream cones on the street, while German cities were reduced to rubble. In one camp, when humid weather hardened several hundred pounds of sugar into lumps, American staff simply threw it out and ordered more. The German prisoners working in the kitchen were horrified, convinced they were witnessing a crime. But for Americans, it wasn't a crisis, it was inconvenience. Germany rationed sugar like a precious metal. America treated it like salt. Sugar became one of the most powerful teachers in the American prison camps. In Germany, sugar had long since vanished into ration books. Civilians received mere scraps of it, barely enough to sweeten a pot of ersatz coffee for a month. Yet in American camps, bowls of sugar sat openly on mess hall tables, free for anyone to scoop. Kitchen bakeries used it by the handful. Cakes appeared regularly. Cookies, pies, sweetened cereals. Prisoners watched American cooks stir sugar into coffee with casual excess, as though it were something infinite. For men raised inside a system obsessed with rationing and scarcity, it was like watching alchemy. Chocolate delivered an even sharper blow. For years, chocolate in Germany had been reserved for propaganda gifts to soldiers or special ration issues, rare and precious. Children in the Reich might see a chocolate bar once a year if they were lucky. Yet, in American camps, chocolate was everywhere. The military alone bought hundreds of millions of pounds of chocolate for rations. PX stores offered candy bars from Hershey, Mars, and Nestle. Red Cross parcels given to prisoners each month included chocolate bars as standard items. German prisoners who had marched through North Africa and Sicily now bought candy bars for 5 or 10 cents with their daily wages. Some prisoners even developed preferences. One liked Hershey's milk chocolate, another preferred Mars bars. The idea that enemies could choose their favorite chocolate while German civilians stood in breadlines tore holes in Nazi propaganda. Thanksgiving arrived in 1943, and with it came the moment that many prisoners later described as the most transformative experience of their captivity. The United States decided that every single German prisoner, more than 400,000 of them, would receive a full American holiday dinner. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, coffee with milk, This was not a gesture of mercy, it was policy. American soldiers ate it, prisoners ate it. Everyone ate it. No distinctions, no hierarchy. No message except one: abundance flows from production, not ideology. Christmas shook them even more. Packages arrived from American civilians, church groups, families, schools, sent to enemy soldiers they had never met. Homemade cookies, candy, games, toiletries, cigarettes. Children wrote letters to German prisoners, wishing them a Merry Christmas. In Hearne, Texas, townspeople delivered trays of homemade sweets to the camp. In Oklahoma, local church groups baked cakes for German soldiers. These acts of kindness from a nation at war contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught them about Americans. By 1944, German prisoners were working outside the camps due to labor shortages. They harvested fruit in Michigan, cut sugar beets in Nebraska, worked in canneries on the West Coast. And everywhere they went, they saw the machinery of American abundance up close. Orchards for maraschino cherries produced tons of fruit, destined not for essential rations, but for ice cream sundaes. German workers watched as American canning factories rejected perfectly edible fruit for being too small or too blemished. These crates were sent to animal feed. In Germany, such fruit would have fed entire families. Here, pigs and cows ate what German children cried for. Sugar beet fields revealed mechanization at a scale the Reich had never achieved. German prisoners realized that a single American farm could outproduce entire regions of Germany. When they saw school cafeterias, they were stunned by the sight of children, ordinary children, receiving hot lunches with milk, vegetables, meat, and sometimes even ice cream. They saw milk delivered daily to thousands of schools, a logistical achievement Germany could not match even for its soldiers. Occasionally, prisoners taken on supervised work details ate in American diners. They saw clerks, truck drivers, and factory workers sitting beside businessmen at the same counters, eating the same meals. Hamburgers for 25 cents, pie for 15, Coca-Cola for 5, ice cream sundaes for 25. The idea that ordinary people, not party officials, not aristocrats, but everyday workers, could buy these foods whenever they wanted shattered the German belief in structured social privilege. In Germany, luxury was for the few. In America, it seemed available to anyone. The shock deepened as prisoners began reading American newspapers and magazines. Production numbers hit them like artillery: 7 million tons of sugar a year, hundreds of millions of pounds of chocolate, billions of bottles of soft drinks, more than 500 million gallons of ice cream, 119 billion pounds of milk. These were not propaganda claims. They were printed openly, proudly, and repeatedly. America produced more milk in a year than Germany could produce in 5. More sugar in a year than Germany had produced in an entire decade of war. It was then that an even more astonishing phenomenon emerged. German prisoners in America began sending food packages home. Using their camp wages, they bought chocolate, coffee, canned meat and gum to mail to their starving families in Germany. Red Cross records confirm that between 1943 and 1946, German prisoners sent approximately 11 million parcels home, most containing food that German civilians could no longer obtain. Families receiving packages from sons held prisoner by the enemy began asking the same question: how is it that our sons, captured and behind barbed wire, are eating better than we are? The truth was undeniable. American rationing was generosity compared to German normalcy. Americans complained bitterly about ration coupons, not realizing that even their strictest wartime limits provided more sugar, meat, and dairy than Germans saw in months. American children still drank milk daily. German children often hadn't tasted it in years. American teenagers ate ice cream in summer. German teenagers watched their city burn. Even the soft drink industry demonstrated a level of abundance that Germany could not rival. Coca-Cola dominated global production, but Americans also consumed Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, Orange Crush, and dozens of regional brands. Factories produced millions of bottles. Distribution networks put them in every gas station, store, and school. Americans consumed so many soft drinks that they were measured in billions of bottles a year. Germany, fighting starvation, had no equivalent industry left at all. And then, in the final months of the war, the ultimate contrast appeared on newsreels. American soldiers in liberated German towns handed out chocolate bars and sticks of chewing gum to children barely strong enough to stand. Those children, who had grown up in scarcity under a regime promising conquest and supremacy, tasted American candy with trembling hands. German prisoners watching these newsreels inside camps felt the last pieces of their old worldview shatter. How could the Reich claim superiority when American soldiers had enough abundance to give candy to enemy children? As the war ended and prisoners returned home, the contrast became painfully visible. Many German POWs returning from the United States were heavier, healthier, and better fed than their families who had lived through the collapse of the Reich. Fathers returned with chocolate bars in their pockets for children who looked at them as though they were miracles. Husbands returned with cans of American coffee. Mothers wept over Red Cross parcels their sons had mailed home, luxuries they had not tasted in years. The transformation was irreversible. When these prisoners finally stepped back onto German soil between 1945 and 1946, they were not the same men who had marched out under Nazi banners. They returned to a homeland that looked like the aftermath of an earthquake, cities reduced to skeletons of stone, families gaunt from hunger, shops stripped bare. The contrast between what they had experienced in American captivity and what they found in their own liberated country felt almost surreal. Many German mothers cried when they saw their sons return not thinner and broken, but healthier, heavier, even glowing with the kind of nourishment Germany had not been able to offer in years. Men who had eaten ice cream and chocolate in prison camps now faced children who had forgotten what sugar tasted like. Their first act, in many cases, was to open their suitcases and hand out American chocolate bars like sacred offerings. Stories spread quickly. Families told neighbors. Neighbors told entire villages. My son came back fatter from prison than he left for war. My husband says they had 3 meals every day, meat and milk. He says he drank Coca-Cola in Tennessee. Word of this abundance traveled faster than propaganda ever had. It seeped into conversations, church meetings, ration lines. The message could not be stopped. The enemy Germany had been taught to fear had treated its prisoners with more kindness, more food, and more dignity than their own government had treated them as civilians. Some returning prisoners carried their last Red Cross parcel in their hands, a package containing chocolate, canned goods, and coffee. Families passed the items around the table, tasting each in awe. Children cut tiny squares from a single Hershey bar to make it last for days. Mothers smelled American coffee like it was perfume. These items became treasured symbols, proof that the world outside Germany operated under different laws of abundance, not deprivation. And then something even more remarkable happened. Former POWs began influencing German reconstruction. These men had seen America's economic engine up close. They had worked in orchards, factories, canneries. They had observed how American supermarkets functioned, how distribution worked, how factories standardized production, how abundance flowed not from conquest, but from organization and efficiency. When the Marshall Plan arrived, many of these former prisoners became its strongest supporters. They knew from experience that American prosperity wasn't propaganda, it was reality. These men became living testimonies. They told German businessmen about candy aisles with dozens of choices. They described supermarkets where even ordinary people bought ice cream on hot days. They recounted stories of American children drinking milk at school from metal dispensers. They had witnessed firsthand how everyday abundance stabilized society. Many would later help introduce American-style retail, packaging, marketing, and food production systems into West Germany. The first modern German supermarkets, the first widespread ice cream parlors, the first mass chocolate distribution networks, all carried fingerprints of men who had once been prisoners, now evangelists for a new way of thinking. Some of these former POWs built entire careers from what they learned in American camps. A few became importers of American goods. Others became business leaders, teachers, or local politicians who advocated for consumer abundance and democratic capitalism. They had lived the difference between scarcity and plenty and understood which system truly worked. Their children grew up hearing stories of Coca-Cola in Tennessee, of ice cream on the 4th of July, of Thanksgiving turkey, shared equally with prisoners, guards, and soldiers. Those stories shaped a generation. To a child in post-war Germany, hearing that their father, captured by the enemy, had eaten better in a prison camp than they did at home felt like hearing a fairy tale. Yet, as West Germany rebuilt, those same children began tasting the truth for themselves. Coca-Cola arrived in 1949 and exploded in popularity. Ice cream parlors appeared in cities that had once been rubble. Supermarkets began stocking chocolate bars and canned goods in quantities that felt unimaginable during the war. The American way that fathers once described with disbelief slowly became part of German daily life. The psychological impact was profound. Former prisoners often described the first Coca-Cola they tasted as symbolic, a moment when an entire worldview cracked open. One veteran said in an interview decades later, "It tasted like the future." Another said, "That drink contained everything Germany wasn't." To others, the first spoonful of ice cream was the moment they understood that the Nazi promise of superiority was an empty shell. Democracy, not dictatorship, delivered abundance. Even decades later, many former POWs could describe every detail of their first American ice cream sundae. The cold shock, the richness, the impossible sweetness, the whipped cream, the cherry, the casual excess of it all. They remembered how American guards didn't treat it as a luxury, but as something normal, routine, even forgettable. Those memories became something like emotional seeds planted in their minds, growing quietly until the war was over, and they returned home ready to rebuild Germany in a new image. Historians today understand the power of this transformation, not through lectures, not through political re-education, but through observation, through lived truth. Through the simple act of feeding enemies so well that their beliefs collapsed under the weight of reality. American abundance didn't argue with Nazi ideology, it erased it. Every Coca-Cola bottle was a lesson in logistical mastery. Every chocolate bar was a message about industrial power. Every ice cream sundae was a demonstration that a free society could produce miracles for ordinary people. The story wasn't about indulgence, it was about proof. The United States didn't try to change German minds by force. It didn't need to. It simply showed them what a functioning democracy could produce, not through speeches, but through sugar bowls left on tables, through desserts served in summer, through Thanksgiving turkeys shared with prisoners, through the casual generosity of towns that baked Christmas cookies for men whose uniforms still bore the insignia of the enemy. By the time these men returned home, the transformation was irreversible. They had tasted democracy, and it was sweet. They had eaten freedom, and it filled them with life. They had sipped American abundance, and it fizzed through their memories forever. They became, almost unintentionally, ambassadors of a new world, one built not on conquest but on creation, not on scarcity but on surplus, not on superiority but on opportunity. And that is how a war that began with tanks and guns found one of its most powerful victories in ice cream and Coca-Cola. How a global conflict reshaped hearts not just through battles but through generosity. How the United States won not only through military might, but through the unbelievable, undeniable evidence of abundance given freely, even to enemies. As the years passed, the memories of American abundance did not fade for these former soldiers. If anything, they grew clearer, sharper, more symbolic. These men, once loyal to a regime that promised dominance through hardship, found themselves forever marked by the simple human experience of being fed well by their captors. They could recall the exact texture of American bread, soft and warm rather than dense and stale. They could recall the taste of real coffee, brewed strong, poured into metal cups already sweetened with as much sugar as they cared to add. They remembered how American cooks never measured it, never rationed it, simply filled large glass bowls with white crystals and placed them on the tables like it was as common as air. Many former prisoners later admitted they had been shocked by one detail more than any other. The Americans wasted food. They threw away crusts. They tossed untouched fruit. They discarded sugar by the pound if it hardened. To German soldiers shaped by years of ration cards and shortages, American wastefulness was not a moral failing. it was terrifying proof of how much the United States could produce. If America could toss aside what Germany fought wars to acquire, then the ideological backbone of Nazi superiority dissolved with every meal. The truth became impossible to deny. German prisoners found themselves living inside a system where even failure seemed abundant, ice melted and remade, fruit spoiled and replaced, milk spilled and refilled, sugar hardened and reordered, and all of it was routine. All of it was normal. Even mistakes cost less than German successes. By the time the war ended, American prison camps had become unlikely classrooms. Everything from the way the PX sold products to the way the mess hall prepared meals worked as quiet lessons in American industrial philosophy. What impressed the prisoners most was not the military itself, but the machinery of civilian life. The way delivery trucks arrived on schedule, the way supplies traveled thousands of miles without disruption, the way stores restocked with precision. These observations formed the blueprint for how Germany later rebuilt itself. When these men returned to Germany carrying stories of ice cream machines in the middle of Tennessee and Coca-Cola bottles sold for a single nickel, they returned as the unexpected carriers of a new world view. They had lived inside a society whose strength did not come from conquest, but from production, from efficiency, from freedom, from the ordinary citizen's access to luxury, and these men poured these stories into their families, their neighbors, their children. The children reacted with disbelief. They imagined American prison camps as fairy tale kingdoms. But soon the myths became reality. Coca-Cola arrived officially in West Germany. Ice cream parlors modeled after American soda fountains popped up in cities still half ruined. Candy bars appeared in stores that only recently had been rationing bread. And as Germany embraced the Marshall Plan and reconstructed its economy, the American model of abundance, witnessed firsthand by former POWs, became the silent blueprint for the nation's revival. Some former prisoners later admitted that the moment they truly stopped believing in Nazi ideology was not in battle, nor after defeat, but during an act of overwhelming contrast, the first time an American guard handed them a candy bar with no conditions, no speeches, no demands. It was the effortless humanity of it, the way Americans gave away what Germans treated like treasure. The way abundance flowed downward, not upward. The way even an enemy could be fed like a neighbor. In countless interviews decades later, former POWs described small moments that broke them open. One remembered watching an American child at a grocery store casually choose between multiple flavors of ice cream. Another remembered the shock of seeing row after row of soda bottles arranged with precise identical labels, as though the entire country moved in rhythm. A third recalled the bewildering sight of a supermarket shelf stacked with dozens of brands of cereal, all for ordinary people. These men had been raised to believe in sacrifice as glory, in scarcity as discipline, in deprivation as proof of national strength. Yet in American captivity they discovered a society where the measure of strength was the ability to give, where citizens did not fear hunger, where factories worked not to compensate for shortages, but to create abundance beyond need, where prosperity was not propaganda but lived reality. This contrast cut deeper than any ideological lecture could. It did something the Allies had not even intentionally planned. It reached into the emotional core of these men's beliefs and rearranged the foundation. Because no argument can defeat lived truth. No speech can erase the memory of tasting your first Coca-Cola after years of ersatz coffee. No propaganda can compete with a bowl of ice cream on a hot American afternoon. These experiences bypassed ideology entirely and spoke directly to the human instinct for comfort, security, and hope. When historians later analyzed the German POW experience in America, they discovered something extraordinary. RE education programs, films, lectures, the formal political tools had limited effect, but food did what politics could not. Generosity did what punishment could not. Abundance did what argument could not. It revealed a world where freedom produced more than dictatorship ever could, where democracy fed even its enemies, where prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. And so, when these prisoners returned home, they returned as carriers of a quiet revolution. They spoke not of American lectures but of American lunches, not of political systems but of ice cream. not of propaganda but of Coca-Cola. They told stories of sugar bowls overflowing, of guards handing out candy bars, of diners serving hamburgers to anyone with a quarter. They told their children that America's strength was not fear or cruelty, but the power to treat abundance like a birthright. In time, those stories shaped generations. They shaped West Germany's consumer economy. They shaped attitudes toward democracy. They shaped the cultural bond between the two nations. Children who had once listened in disbelief eventually walked into stores where Coca-Cola filled shelves and ice cream sat in freezers. The impossible became normal. The unbelievable became ordinary. And decades later, when these former POWs were old men sitting in their living rooms recounting those days, they often said the same thing. The victory that mattered most wasn't the military defeat. It was the moment a German soldier tasted a Coca-Cola in Tennessee and realized that everything he had believed about the world was wrong. That simple drink became the symbol of a new truth, that freedom tastes better than fear, that abundance is more powerful than ideology, that generosity can dismantle hatred, and that sometimes the most devastating blow to a worldview comes not from bullets or bombs, but from a spoonful of ice cream shared with your enemy. As the post-war years unfolded, former prisoners found themselves carrying the memory of America like a hidden map in their minds. The Germany they returned to was starving, fractured, exhausted. Cities were blackened shells, families rationed everything, hunger hung in the air like smoke. Yet these men had spent years in a place where food was not rationed but produced endlessly, where sweets and sodas were not symbols of luxury but everyday comforts. And so they became storytellers. Everywhere they went, they repeated the same impossible descriptions of life in America. People listened because they needed to believe that such a world existed. These men spoke of PX stores filled with candy bars stacked like bricks. They spoke of Coca-Cola crates unloaded in rows, the bottles clinking together like glass jewels. They described ice cream so abundant that a camp could serve it to thousands of prisoners on a humid July afternoon. They recounted diners where the rich and poor placed the same order from the same menu. They spoke of supermarkets bursting with choices, more choices than entire German cities had seen in years. These stories did more than comfort people. They rewired a nation's imagination. The transformation reached deepest into the children. Many grew up listening to their father's stories, not entirely believing them, but unable to forget them. They heard about soft drinks that fizzed with sweetness, candy bars so rich they melted on your fingers, ice cream sundaes layered with chocolate syrup and cherries. To a generation raised on water soups and thin bread slices, these tales sounded like fairy stories. Yet when the economic miracle began, when American goods poured into West Germany through trade, the fairy tales came to life. Imagine a child who had spent years hearing whispers that their father once tasted an American chocolate bar in captivity. Then one day they walk into a shop and see that same Hershey label sitting on a shelf. They unwrapped it, they tasted it. And in that moment, their father's stories transformed from myth to truth. That single moment, small, quiet, deeply personal, helped knit an entire generation closer to the West. Historians have long tried to quantify the effect of American prisoner camps on German reconstruction. They measured production charts, political reforms, economic initiatives. Yet they often missed the human part, the silent revolution born from simple food, because what happened inside those camps was not political conversion. It was emotional reorientation. The prisoners had tasted a society built on abundance, efficiency, and fairness. They had seen how democracy fed its citizens, and even its enemies. They had lived inside a system where ordinary people enjoyed luxuries the Reich could not provide even to its elite. That experience became the foundation for a new Germany. Some former prisoners opened small businesses inspired by what they observed, cafes with American-style desserts, grocery shops that stocked variety instead of scarcity, ice cream stands that mimicked the American soda fountains they remembered. Others became workers or managers in factories rising from the ruins, applying lessons of standardization they had witnessed in American production lines. A few rose to political life, quietly championing the idea that a nation's strength lay not in ideology or conquest, but in the well-being of its citizens. Many entered the booming post-war retail sector, helping build the early West German supermarket culture that mirrored the American model. Their stories fed a national hunger, not for food, but for hope, and that hunger shaped West Germany's cultural identity. The miracle did not happen because of money alone. It happened because the first people to believe Germany could become prosperous again were men who had seen prosperity with their own eyes while sitting behind barbed wire in Tennessee and Texas. They had lived inside a world where ice cream was everyday joy, where soft drinks were sipped casually, where children wasted food because abundance was normal. They returned home and told a broken country that such a world was possible. The psychological power of that testimony cannot be overstated. People who have tasted abundance, or at least believed it to be achievable, rebuild faster than those who know only deprivation. When Germans saw chocolate bars and Coca-Cola return to shelves in the late 1940s, they did not treat them merely as treats. They viewed them as symbols of recovery, proof that the world could be good again. And because former POWs had told their families exactly what abundance felt like, the return of these products carried emotional weight far beyond their sweetness. By the 1950s, entire German towns held festivals where American-style ice cream was served. Children bought Coca-Cola at corner stores. Families indulged in desserts no longer as fantasy but as routine. And behind all of this cultural shift were the memories of prisoners who had once stood in American mess halls marveling at sugar bowls filled to the brim. Even decades later, when researchers interviewed these former prisoners as elderly men, the memories came back to them with astonishing clarity. They remembered the exact fizz of their first Coca-Cola, the cold shock of ice cream on a summer day, the disbelief when they first held a candy bar in a prison camp PX. Some recalled watching American guards casually drink sodas and toss the half-finished bottles aside, a moment that struck them harder than any battlefield engagement. They said it was then they realized Germany had lost, not just the war but the argument. The idea that sacrifice and suffering created strength collapsed in the face of effortless American abundance. And so, in telling their stories, the former POWs reshaped the imagination of a nation. They became the bridge between a defeated past and a prosperous future. Their lived experiences undermined Nazi ideology more thoroughly than any courtroom trial or political lecture ever could. They had tasted the truth, and it was impossible to forget. In the end, historians often summarize this transformation with a single idea: Germany was not re-educated by coercion. It was re-educated by Coca-Cola, by chocolate, by ice cream, by the shock of discovering that a free society could produce more than a totalitarian regime could even dream of. The victory that mattered most happened not in battlefields, but in kitchens, canteens, PX stores, and mess halls. It happened in the fizz of a soft drink, the sweetness of a candy bar, the cold creaminess of ice cream served to defeated soldiers. These moments softened hearts, shattered illusions, and planted the seeds of a different future. And that is why, even now, the story of German POWs in America remains one of the most unexpected triumphs of the entire war. A victory won not through bullets or bombs, but through generosity. A victory of abundance over ideology. A victory of kindness over cruelty. A victory achieved incredibly with Coca-Cola and ice cream. As West Germany rebuilt through the late 1940s and early 1950s, the influence of those former POWs became more visible than anyone expected. They were scattered across towns and cities, across farms and factories, carrying memories that quietly shaped the choices they made. Many had spent their captivity working in American agriculture, food processing plants, or distribution centers. They had watched how supply networks moved with almost mechanical precision, how quality control inspectors rejected goods that German factories would have considered luxury items, how standardization made everything, from chocolate bars to soda bottles, consistent across an entire continent. These lessons didn't remain abstract. They turned into action. Some of the men became early adopters of mass production principles. Others helped modernize bakeries or food distribution systems. A few opened grocery stores that tried to mimic the organized, brightly lit markets they remembered from America. And as American companies began establishing themselves in West Germany, they found a surprising ally in the returning prisoners who already knew their products, understood their systems, and respected the ethos behind them. Coca-Cola's re-entry into West Germany became a cultural milestone. For many families, the first bottle of Coke tasted at home was not a new product. It was a family legend finally made tangible. Ice cream parlors modeled after American soda fountains began appearing in cities still bearing the scars of bombings. Children crowded around glass counters, choosing flavors with the same breathless joy that prisoners once felt in Tennessee, thousands of miles away. Candy bars became common again, not rationed, not rare, but affordable snacks, echoes of the PX shelves that had once stunned hardened German soldiers. Meanwhile, the deeply emotional memories remained. Former prisoners often described what it felt like to walk into a modern West German supermarket for the first time. Some reportedly stopped in the aisles and stared in silence at the rows of packaged foods, at the variety of sweets, at the stacks of milk cartons and bottles. They whispered to their families, "This is what America was like." The shelves made real what had once felt like an impossible dream. Many of these men became advocates, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, for aligning West Germany with the West. They had discovered firsthand that freedom produced abundance, and that abundance created stability. They knew that societies defined by scarcity eventually turned to anger and extremism. They had lived through that already. They had survived it. They had escaped it only because they were captured and taken into a world built on a different foundation. Years later, when historians interviewed these men as old veterans, their memories returned with startling clarity. They remembered the exact feel of a cold Coca-Cola bottle in their hands, the metallic click of the cap being pried off, the sting of carbonation on the tongue after years of drinking bitter ersatz coffee. They remembered the shock of ice cream melting across their fingers on a hot southern afternoon. They remembered the smell of fresh bread rising from American mess halls. They described entire scenes with precision: sunlight on PX shelves, the hum of refrigerators, the sound of American guards chatting casually while drinking sodas. These memories weren't about indulgence. They were about a revelation that hit them harder than the Allied invasion. They realized that the society they had been told was weak and decadent was, in truth, strong in ways Germany could never be. Strong not because of cruelty or discipline, but because it had mastered the art of creating enough for everyone. Strong because abundance was the foundation, not the exception. Strong because it didn't fear giving luxuries even to its enemies. And in those recollections, one detail appeared again and again: the lack of hierarchy in American abundance. A farm worker and a banker could sit beside each other at a diner counter and eat the same hamburger for the same price. Children bought chocolate bars without ration cards. Soldiers and civilians shared the same Coca-Cola. Even prisoners received holiday dinners identical to those served to American troops. This equality stunned German prisoners raised under a system obsessed with strict social tiers. They discovered a different kind of strength shared, not hoarded. Some former POWs went so far as to say that it wasn't America's military power that defeated Nazi ideology. It was America's abundance. They believed that the taste of ice cream and the sight of overflowing PX shelves did more to dismantle their belief systems than any battlefield loss. Because ideology collapses quickly when it comes face to face with a better way of living. And for these men, that better way was not an idea, it was a lived experience, a sweet drink, a cold dessert, a warm meal, a full stomach. And so the legacy spread. Families who heard these stories passed them down. Children told their children. And gradually, an entire society internalized the lesson: prosperity brings peace. Scarcity breeds extremism. If Germany wanted a future, it had to choose abundance over ideology. This is why, even now, historians refer to the German POW experience in America as one of the most unexpectedly successful RE education processes in history, not through lectures, not through punishment, but through observation, through kindness, through a lived demonstration of what freedom and industrial might could achieve. Showed that democracy does not need to threaten an enemy to change him. It only needs to feed him. And at the heart of that revelation were the simple foods Americans took for granted: Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, ice cream, pudding, pies, milk, fresh bread. Luxuries that Germans had forgotten. Luxuries that, paradoxically, turned into the most powerful tools of ideological transformation the war ever produced. In the end, it is impossible to separate the story of Germany's post-war recovery from the story of those prisoners who saw American abundance up close. They brought back more than stories. They brought back a new blueprint for society. They had tasted a different future. And once a man has tasted such sweetness, he cannot return to bitterness. With that sweetness came something else, something deeper than food or comfort. It came with a sense of possibility. For those former prisoners, America was not just a place. It was a vision of what a society could be when its energy was directed toward creation instead of destruction. They had lived inside a machine of abundance, and they carried that machine home inside their memories. They talked about it in workshops and fields and dinner tables. They told their children that a country's greatness was measured not by its armies, but by the way it fed its people. They told neighbors that democracy did not feel like chaos the way Nazi newspapers had claimed. It felt like choice. It felt like freedom. It tasted like a cold soda on a hot afternoon, and slowly the story spread across a wounded nation eager to rebuild. By the mid-1950s, West Germany began to reflect those lessons in ways both subtle and unmistakable. New factories rose, powered not by military directives but by market demand. Grocery stores expanded and modernized. Supply chains grew cleaner and more reliable. Food became more plentiful, more varied. What had once been luxuries, chocolate bars, canned fruit, flavored drinks, became ordinary items again. Housewives began filling shopping baskets with goods their own mothers could not have imagined. During the war, children bought ice cream cones on weekends, as though they had always been part of German childhood. The harsh, rationing years faded, replaced by a culture that valued reliability, fairness, efficiency, and above all else, availability. And in many towns, if you paid close attention, you could see the fingerprints of those former POWs everywhere, a bakery using American-style packaging, a grocery store organized with wide aisles and bright lighting because its owner once stocked shelves in a camp commissary, a distribution hub modeled on the factories in Kansas and Illinois, where a POW once loaded crates of canned peaches. Even the early supermarket movement in Germany, stores where customers picked their own items instead of requesting them from a clerk, borrowed ideas directly from the American systems these men had observed. Underneath all the economic recovery ran a current of emotional memory that never truly disappeared. Former POWs often spoke of the moment when they first realized the war was more than lost, it was unwinnable.